actually head of programs, and David Attenborough, and a man called Paul Fox. That was often thought of as a golden age of British television.
Yeah.
And it was in one sense. I mean, the drama on British television has never been better than it is today. I mean, it's quite superb. But unfortunately, everything else has gone down the tubes. The Music and Arts Department, for example, which was they would have said was the lifeblood of the BBC, that's more or less vanished. And it's vanished because they claim there is no audience for it. But I mean, that's a nonsense. I mean, I'm sure Hugh Green and Hugh Weldon and Paul Fox and David Attenborough, well, not David Attenborough, David Attenborough's still with us, as is Paul Fox. But I'm sure they're swiveling their graves in outrage about the slow but sure destruction of music on. I'm talking about the BBC now. Music on BBC and the arts generally. I mean, the BBC always says, "Oh well, we do the proms," which is true. They do 90 some odd concerts, and they're remarkable and they're to be treasured. But they use that as an excuse for not bothering to do anything else. And all the great music programs that were done in the 60s, they've gone. That's understandable. I mean, fashions change, but I mean, I think it's a dereliction of their duty, really. I mean, Hugh Weldon always said, I mean, I remember Hugh Weldon reading at a departmental meeting a review which said of one particular music program, and he said it's a real tragedy that, you know, such wonderful programs get minority audiences. So Hugh had looked up what the audience was, and he said that the minority audience for that particular program was 3 million people. Then there was a pause, and Hugh said that would fill the Royal Festival Hall for 5 years. In what sense is that a minority program? That's ridiculous. The other great, I mean, the reason it was a golden age was partly because it did produce some wonderful programs, but also there was a different spirit about the place. You know, it didn't, for Hugh, it didn't matter if something failed. What was important was that you said what you meant and you meant what you said. That was the only thing that was important. And he would never have contemplated focus groups or executive producers. I mean, when the credits roll round now on certain programs on BBC television, I mean, the credits are longer than the film. And I mean, there's endless people who are executive producers, associate producers. I mean, it's just ridiculous. I've just done an interview, in fact, for an American television company where, I mean, I got completely confused. I mean, I think I counted up about 15 different executive or associate producers. You know, it's silly.
Yeah, I'm surprised at the beginning too of any presentation at all the production companies that are involved.
Hopeless.
There's an endless list. But Hugh Weldon seems like a really kind of an honorable person to me, and not to.
Well, I mean, he was a very distinguished military man, apart from anything else. I mean, he won the Military Cross in the war, which is quite something. He had a kind of imperial bearing. I mean, you wouldn't question him. Or no, that's not true. You would question him. He would invite you to question him. But my God, you better be sure of your arguments. If you see what I mean. He was a very kind man. I mean, he took all kinds of people under his wing, and he took tremendous risks. I mean, if he thought it was worth doing. I mean, when Ken Russell made the famous Elgar film, that was a tremendous risk, and that was produced by Hugh Weldon. That was a tremendous risk because no one had ever actually made a film where a composer, admittedly dead, was actually being impersonated, if you see what I mean. I mean, now it seems pathetic, but in those days that was a huge leap into the dark, and I know that, I mean, I I wasn't around when that film was made, but I mean, I was because I worked with Ken Russell later on, I was very aware of how chancy they thought that was, and how they would be criticised and attacked and so on and so on. But of course that didn't turn out to be the case because it was such a wonderful film. So I mean, he was a true inspirational leader. That's the point about them all, as was Hugh Green. I mean, Hugh Green, who was the great Director General, after Reith, who founded the BBC, Hugh Green, who was the Director General in the late 50s and throughout the 60s, was a kind of inspirational leader. You know, you could actually talk to him, if you see what I mean.
Mm-hmm.
And he encouraged everybody, and he encouraged talent, and he wanted people out there on the front line, as it were. And Hugh Weldon was the same, as was David Attenborough. I mean, they were all exactly the same. Paul Fox was an interesting case because Paul Fox had worked in the sports desk of a tabloid newspaper. So, I mean, he came in, you know, he was sort of all muscles and elbows, but in the same way, I mean, he was truly an inspirational character. You thought, this is the kind of person that we ought to have leading the troops. You don't feel that about any of the non-entities who now run the BBC.
Well, it seems like when I think of American television during that time, it's very mercenary and commercial, right? And was there, I know that the BBC was the government broadcasting, but was there a...
No, it wasn't. That's a terrible misnomer about the BBC.
Really? Okay.
The BBC was set up by a charter. It had permission to broadcast, as it were. But, I mean, the way in which it was made independent from the government from the very beginning, you know, annoyed the government, but that was in the Royal Charter. The government could not interfere, could not be seen to be interfering in the BBC. And there are famous instances all the way down the history of the BBC, where the BBC, for example, during the Suez invasion, the Suez inventure, the BBC consistently broadcast Hugh Gaitskell, who was the leader of the Labour Party at that point, attacking the government of Anthony Eden, saying this is utter folly. And this drove the government mad, and the government was kind of issuing, you know, we will destroy the BBC, we will close it, it can't criticise the government. And of course, Mrs. Thatcher was the same. Mrs. Thatcher hated the BBC because the BBC had, you know, opposed Mrs. Thatcher. It didn't oppose Mrs. Thatcher, but it allowed Mrs. Thatcher's point of view to be put across, but it also allowed the opposite point of view to be put across. And she objected to that. She said, you know, again, the famous example is that, you know, she refused permission for, you could have newsreel of Sinn Féin, sometimes known as the IRA, but you couldn't ever hear what those people said. It was forbidden. And she imposed that on the BBC. And, I mean, to general, and the only person who came out of that badly was Mrs. Thatcher. Eventually, she realised this is absolutely ridiculous. You know, we need to hear what the leaders of Sinn Féin, Martin McGuinness and Gerry Adams, are saying. So, you know, she again was the one. And then most recently, we have this idiot who was a favourite of Boris Johnson called Nadine Dorries. Nadine Dorries, you know, was threatening to close down the BBC altogether virtually because it opposed Boris Johnson. It didn't oppose Boris Johnson, but it didn't hide the fact that there were a lot of things you could say against Boris Johnson. So, I mean, you know, the hostility of the government of the day to the BBC has been an ongoing saga from the very, very beginning. So the notion that the BBC is the government voice is ridiculous. That the opposite is true.
Yeah, and I noticed that even in the drama shows, if they were about an intelligence service or or a police service or something. It's actually very it gives a lot of nuance and is actually kind of critical of the government.
Well, I mean, part of the BBC's charter is that nations shall speak truth unto nations. Now, I mean, Mr. Putin should know this. It doesn't.
So the other television stations start branching off into like regional stations like Yorkshire or Granada.
No, that's independent television.
Okay.
That independent television's again set up by a conservative government in 1955, I think. And one of the emphasis originally was that there should be much more local broadcasting. There was the general worry, and there still is a general worry, that the BBC was then too metropolitan centred. It was centred on London and everything that happened in London. Of course, the BBC has made enormous effort to change that. So now it has its big studios in Manchester, which are every bit as important as the studios in London. But part of the reason for setting up independent television is that there should be local companies, one in Yorkshire, one in Scotland, one in the west of England, one in East Anglia, one in Wales, and so on. And that was one of its strengths originally. But gradually, that changed simply because of commercial needs. You know, if somebody's going to, if Coca-Cola is going to advertise on ITV, independent television, it wanted a network. It didn't want to just advertise in the west of England or in Yorkshire. You know, it wanted a network. So gradually, although the local companies gave the appearance of continuing, in fact, they became much more centralized in terms of content than ever the BBC was.
So there seems to be kind of a conflict between the commercialization of these different networks and the quality of programming. And
no, I don't think so. I mean, I think that again, that's a misunderstanding. I mean, Granada Television, which operated out of Manchester, independent television. I mean, Granada Television were doing the kind of news reporting that the BBC hadn't ever dared to do. I mean, really extraordinary. It was called the show was called World in Action, and it was investigating all kinds of social and political problems in a way that the BBC hadn't dared to do. The BBC was much more, with a small c, much more conservative. BBC was shocked by what Granada managed to achieve in terms of its news and social coverage. Granada also had an amazing and very quickly established tradition of great drama. That was helped by the fact that the head of drama of Granada Television happened to be the brother-in-law of Laurence Olivier. So I mean, that helped. But I mean, all kinds of extraordinary and very important drama directors who later achieved fame internationally. Started in Granada. I mean, it was the place to go if you wanted to be a drama director. So the notion that it was somehow the quality was less is nonsense.
I guess what I was getting at was the kind of like the Lou Grade style of.
Well, no, I mean Lou Grade. He ran a company called ATV, which operated out of London. But if you take another commercial station that operated out of London called London Weekend Television, London Weekend Television gave birth to the South Bank show. And there wasn't anything the equivalent of the South Bank show because, I mean, that, in terms of arts coverage, that's thanks to Melvyn Bragg. But I mean, ATV, Lou recognized a good thing when he saw it, as it were. And of course, and it was ran from a commercial point of view. But I mean, it was Lou Grade. He'd heard of somebody called, I'm caricaturing it now, but he'd heard of somebody called Maria Callas. He'd heard that Maria Callas was performing at Covent Garden. So Lou Grade ordered ATV to get down to Covent Garden and film Maria Callas. BBC wasn't doing that.
Did you ever...
Lou Grade, after all, did what is still thought to be the definitive history of Jesus. I think, is it called Jesus? I think it is called Jesus, with Robert Powell, directed by Zeffirelli.
Right.
That was Lou Grade.
That's Jesus of Nazareth, I think.
Jesus of Nazareth, that's right, yeah. That was Lou Grade. Shouldn't ever underestimate Lou Grade. Lou Grade was a wonderful man. I mean, I liked him enormously. I mean, big, jolly, cigar-smoking, old-style Hollywood mogul, really, who was an immigrant. I mean, he was a son of Russian immigrants, and he and his two brothers, when they first started to make their way in England and immediately after the First World War, they were a tap dance act.
Did you ever have any dealings with Patrick McGoohan at all?
With who? Patrick McGoohan?
Yeah.
No, only to watch and see what a wonderful actor he was.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I'm a big fan of The Prisoner.
Yeah, he's fantastic.
Yeah. I guess what I meant to...
as Edward the First in what's the William Wallace film. What's it called? The Mel Gibson.
Oh,
William
yeah,
Wallace.
Braveheart. Yeah.
Braveheart.
Yeah.
Patrick McGoohan as Edward the First is sensational.
Were those regional television stations, were they broadcast nationally?
They did. I mean, but in a limited way. I mean, if, for example, Granada, which it did a television version of King Lear starring Laurence Olivier, well, there was no way they were not going to get that on the network. World in Action, which I mentioned from Granada, that was always on the network. Coronation Street, which was started, which is the oldest, longest-running soap opera, I think, in world television, that started in Granada, and that was networked. London Weekend, when it started with the South Bank show, that was networked. They were obliged by their charter to do a lot of local programming, but the quality end of their programming was definitely made available to the networks.
It seems like a lot of stage blurred into television, where a lot of these playwrights started writing for television, and a lot of the actors were from the Royal Shakespeare Company.
Oh yes, I mean I think that was the first major discovery. Once independent television got going, the major discovery was that you could earn a living as an actor on television and then move to film and then move to the stage, and nobody took any notice. It was just, you were either a good actor or you weren't a good actor. And a lot of great acting and great writing for the theatre and for television and for the movies was encouraged by television. I mean, the BBC had something called the Wednesday Play. I mean, and I think all great playwrights of that era, the 50s and 60s, including John Osborne, including Harold Pinter, including Alan Ayckbourn, including, you can go on, Michael Frayn, they all wrote, David Rudkin, they all wrote for the Wednesday Play.
And Play for Today, right?
Play for Today, yeah.
Yeah.
They were given various labels, but yes, there was enormous upsurge in writing for the theatre. I mean, writing drama. You see what I mean?
Yeah. The difference that I've seen is the actual drama shows, like the shows about criminals or villains. They're not glamorized at all, and it kind of comes off as I mean, compared to American television, where the mafia or these criminal groups are always always kind of glamorized, or the depiction on in British television is always really depressing, and it kind of gives a cautionary tale about these things. And
well, I think it's horses for courses. It varies. I don't think you can make a generality.
yeah,
I mean, there has been some very, very good drama, and now that Ken Burns has become a saint, or is running for Pope, I mean, his documentaries have certainly would. I mean, although I think they're far too long and undisciplined, they would certainly. You'd think, oh well, they were made by a British director.
yeah. I'm not a big fan of Ken Burns, but
Well, they just go on and on and on.
yeah. And so, did you work on the Monitor show?
No, Monitor had finished by the time I arrived. Monitor ran from about 57 to about 65, and that's just when I joined the BBC. I mean, it was just that was the name of that particular series.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, the tradition which it started very much continued, and I benefited from it. It then became a series of programs called Omnibus. It morphed into Omnibus. And Omnibus, I mean, one of the extraordinary things about Omnibus, I mean, from which I definitely benefit, the first film I did, well, the only film I did with Ken, called Isadora, that was an Omnibus. But when I did, for example, the film about Cream Farewell Concert, there was no question where that was going to go. That was going to go in Omnibus. And the previous week of Omnibus was a film about Henry Moore, the sculptor. So it was what Monitor had done, which Omnibus benefited from, and the South Bank show, when it started in the late 70s, also benefited from. It made no distinction between, as it were, popular art, serious art, classical music, popular music, sculpture. You know, they were the arts. We have to consider each one of them separately and worthy of attention.
So did you you were mostly concentrating on on musical assignments for BBC then?
No, not particularly. I did whatever came along.
Yeah, and how were things assigned to you? Did you choose them yourself and then offer them up, or did they give you assignments?
Well, it varied. I mean, there was an editor of the program, and he would suggest things, and I would suggest things, and you know, everybody else in that little department would suggest things, and he would choose and say, "Let's do this, let's do that."
So how did you come upon the Alice in Wonderland project?
Well, Alice in Wonderland was interesting because we did. Ken and I did this film called Isadora, which was a big hit, and not long after, I think the film had not even been completely finished. I was summoned by Hugh Weldon, who said, "We have a problem." And I said, "What is the problem?" He said, "Jonathan Miller wants to make a film." And I said, "Well, what's the problem?" And he said, "Well, we don't want Jonathan Miller to make a film." And I said, "Oh, really? Why?" He said, "Well, Jonathan Miller's never made a film, and we're a bit worried and a bit nervous that it will just run away with itself." But, you know, as you've managed to produce a film with Ken Russell, you know, who's not exactly one of the most disciplined of people, you know, we think we need a pair of safe hands to guide Jonathan through. Would you do that? And I said, "Well, that's really up to Jonathan." So anyway, I met Jonathan before. I mean, I'd met Jonathan, I knew him, but we went to have a talk about it. And Jonathan said, you know, he was quite willing to let me organize his film, as it was his film, without any question. But I effectively was the producer of it, trying to keep Jonathan on the straight and narrow. I mean, and I suggested quite a lot of the casting, and quite a lot of, I think I found most of the locations, And it was my idea, certainly, to use Ravi Shankar for the music. So, I mean, I made a contribution, but it was really Jonathan's film.
What was it like on the set of that production?
Well, I mean, it was like any film. It was a bit chaotic, a bit busy. You've got a schedule which you've got to keep to, and trying to keep all of these extraordinary people, whether Peter Sellers or Michael Redgrave or whoever it was, but again, I mean, one shouldn't exaggerate those things, because I mean, Peter, for example, who I later went on to make a big film with, Peter Sellers, they were incredibly professional people. And they were very aware that this was being made for television, therefore on a limited budget, and don't mess about. I mean, Michael Redgrave was absolutely charming. I think I was more frightened of having to deal with Michael Redgrave than I was with any of the others. But I mean, a lot of the people I already knew, as did Jonathan, of course. I mean, people like Peter Cook and Dudley Moore and Alan Bennett. Those were his three mates from Beyond the Fringe.
And how was that production received?
With surprise, I think. I mean, it was the first film which took a completely different view of what Lewis Carroll intended. That there was that this was a very Victorian view of fantasy. And Jonathan, quite rightly, in my view, emphasized that and made it very almost dark film. I mean, it wasn't the kind of Hollywood Technicolor version of Alice in Wonderland. It was a much more serious attempt to understand what it was that Lewis Carroll had in mind. And of course, it didn't duck the question of what was Lewis Carroll thinking about when he was photographing that teenage girl. So there were elements of that in it as well.
It seems like something that was very different from anything that had been on television before. That at least.
Well, as far as Alice was concerned, yes, that's definitely the case. But I mean, there was, it fitted well into the strain of Play for Today and Play for Today, the Wednesday play or whatever it was, which were quite frequently. I mean, you think of the Dennis Potter films. I mean, those were very serious examinations of contemporary social problems. So, although Alice was dealing with the 19th century as opposed to the 20th century, there was the same. It didn't stick out in the sense that it was revolutionary. It was different because it didn't take that kind of Hollywood pretty. What a funny little story about this woman who went down the rabbit hole, or this girl who went down the rabbit hole.
Did you know Dennis Potter very well?
Well, not very well. I never worked with him, but I mean, I knew him to say hello to, but that was all.
So that group of guys like Peter Sellers and Peter Cook and the comedians of that era, did you have relationships with those guys and like friendships with them?
I mean, very much so, because I mean they were 4 or 5 years older than me. But I mean, Alan Bennett. I mean, I still occasionally see. And Peter Cook became a very, very good friend. I mean, they were. It was a bit like the early rock and roll world. I mean, there weren't divisions. You just knew these people because they were part of the scenery almost, and you sensed that they had a very substantial contribution to make.
It seems like that world of popular music or rock and roll and that world of Peter Sellers and that acting world kind of mold into each other, and it
well, they did. I mean, and you met them all the time, and if you went, I mean, in the cafe culture of the mid '60s, you could go to the local pizzeria and all almost, and there happened to be once. There happened to be several times. You go to the local pizzeria, and Brian Jones would be there with some girl, and you never thought about it. You just said, "Hi, Brian, how are you? Fine, I'm fine," and then on you went. And also, of course, the most important achievement in a sense of that group of people was the magazine Private Eye, and Private Eye is still running. And Private Eye is the scourge of government, the scourge of Fleet Street, the scourge of any kind of local hypocrisy and shenanigans, and it's an absolutely invaluable source of information about what really goes on, as opposed to what these various institutions want you to believe goes on. And I mean, that was the essence of all of those people. Peter Cook happened to be a comedian of genius. Jonathan less so, except a wonderful mimic. Dudley just a wonderful musician. But Alan Bennett a very substantial playwright.
How did the kind of old guard of television, the Hugh Weldon types, how did they react to all the social change going on in the 60s with rock and roll?
Embraced it.
Really?
I mean, don't forget that. I mean, Hugh Green was the major supporter of That Was the Week That Was, which was, as it were, Private Eye but on television. I mean, eventually he got worried that it was going to be running at the same time as numerous rather critical general elections. So he didn't take it off, but I mean he kept it in the shadows while these general elections, because it was the first major shift from the Conservative government to the Labour government in 1964, and I think Hugh Green worried that the government, the incoming government, would take a swipe at the BBC because the BBC had supported this kind of scurrilous entertainment. But in fact, I mean, it was compulsive viewing. Everybody watched it. So partly because it was satirical, and funny, but also partly because it really made a big attempt to get behind the headlines, and that's exactly what Private Eye still does. I mean, Private Eye is compulsory reading.
So by the time that you made all You Need Is Loving, you had already had relationships or friendships with a lot of the people that you interviewed in that documentary, yeah?
I didn't hear the question, sorry.
By the time that you started making All You Need Is Love, you had already established relationships with a lot of the people that were featured there.
Well, no, you're thinking of All My Loving, which was the first.
All My Loving, yeah. Sorry.
Yeah. Well, I did. I mean, I believed. I thought it was necessary that we understood what these people said. It was self-evident that they were great musicians, and that I wished to demonstrate, which the BBC had at that point completely failed to do because of the way it treated pop music. It thought of pop music as sort of popcorn music, really. And I knew that there was something much more substantial going on. You couldn't miss it. I mean, it was hardly a discovery of mine. I mean, it was, this, although it was pre-Woodstock, it was definitely post, hang on, somebody's just flashed me. It was definitely post-Monterey, and, it was clear that something was happening, and All My Loving was an attempt to describe that and demonstrate it and celebrate it, really.
So the footage that you have of Jimi Hendrix and the interview footage, that's your footage, right?
You what? I can't hear you.
You actually interviewed Jimi Hendrix?
Of course.
For that? Yeah. What was your impression of Jimi Hendrix?
Well, I mean, Jimi Hendrix, you couldn't miss the fact that he was a phenomenally gifted guitarist. But actually, what was interesting about him was that, as he said, his whole life was his music on stage. that was how he sought to express himself, because he was not good with words. No, I just thought he was just very shy, very courteous, called you sir all the time, and very charming. I mean, you couldn't help but be charmed by him.
I think that's the people don't really see that side of Jimi Hendrix. They think of him as kind of a
they choose
bold.
not to.
Yeah.
They choose not to. It's not that it's not there. It's perfectly clear it's there. That it's, and if you read any of the biographies, of which there have been several, and one or two rather good ones, that comes across. I mean, of his very, very complicated and troubled background. But essentially, you're dealing with a very nice man who happened to be a wonderful guitarist.
One of the things that I thought was very interesting in that documentary series was the like when you're talking to Donovan, when he talks about how they never thought of all the contracts that they were signing during that time, and
that's in All You Need Is Love. That's in the later film.
Yeah, and that they were kind of riding a wave during that time, and then sometime in the early 70s they're confronted with all these things they signed.
They were very naive. I mean, the early contracts that Brian Epstein signed on behalf of the Beatles were really terrible contracts. I mean, they were more in favor of the record company than they were of the Beatles themselves, which the Beatles recognized very quickly. And that accounted for a lot of the mess that everything got into in terms of financial arrangements as far as the Beatles was concerned. But I mean, their excuse would have been, and Brian's excuse would have been, as his brother told me, he said, we just, we had absolutely no idea quite what we were doing. We were taken advantage of.
Do you think that played a part in Epstein's suicide?
No.
Yeah, I thought it was very interesting how you interviewed Epstein's mother and his brother.
Oh, yeah, Greenie. Yeah. No, I think, Brian's suicide, there were so many complicated things. I mean, homosexuality, and of course to be homosexual at that time was illegal. His worry that, somehow he wasn't doing justice by the boys, as he would have called them. There were all kinds of very complicated things. And he was a very lonely chap too. And I think he took, Lennon in particular, but I think it was true of all four of them. They were and remained forever very abrasive people. And I think this middle class Jewish lad from Liverpool couldn't cope with that. Really, I think that's what it amounted to. And he felt, if John Lennon said something critical of Brian would take that as deeply personal and deeply hurting. And I mean, John just was making a rather bad joke, probably. I mean, I don't know, but I suspect that there was a lot of that. I think Brian was just very lonely, and I think extremely worried about his homosexuality. And I mean, his mother, and I think he was worried that his mother would find out that he was gay.
Really? Huh.
Oh yeah, I'm sure. I mean, nice upper middle class Jewish lad from Liverpool being gay. Come on, don't think so. Especially, as I said, at a time when it was illegal.
I watched an interview with Roger Waters a couple of months ago, and he was talking about the kind of difference between the way that the producers or managers would find a bunch of young men in the 50s and make stars out of them, opposed to how the Beatles were kind of an organic force that just came along and kind of from the ground up on their own, and the difference between that. And and I thought that was interesting.
Well, I think Roger's quite a wise. He and I went to the same school. I'm sure you know that. He's quite a wise commentator on his on the world that he prospered in. And I mean, you could say, and I think it's probably not too much of an exaggeration, to say that that's what he describes, particularly in The Wall, but also in Dark Side of the Moon. I mean, they are very autobiographical, both of those albums.
There was a movie made called Stardust in the mid-70s too, that seemed to address that whole conflict. And
yes, that was made by David Putnam, wasn't it? With I've forgotten the name of the singer, but it was good. No,
David Essex, I think.
David Essex, absolutely right. Yeah, David Essex.
Yeah. So it seems like the managers, at least Epstein, we think of these people, the managers, as kind of exploitative, but they were kind of pioneering themselves and kind of going into a frontier that was unexplored themselves in a way.
Completely. And I mean, the great example of this was Peter Grant, who became the manager of Led Zeppelin. Now, Peter Grant was the first person who came along and said to promoters and to record companies, fuck you, if you don't, unless you give my boys what they deserve, we ain't coming. And that was a big shock to promoters and record companies. And Peter Grant, who was kind of at least 6 foot tall and certainly 6 foot across, came across as a bully. But a bully on behalf of his troops, on behalf of Led Zeppelin. But actually, he was a pussycat. I mean, he was a really nice, interesting, jolly man. But boy, if you crossed him in terms of a contract, you could be in serious trouble. Now, that was completely unknown. I mean, Robert Stigwood was who I think was a good manager in his way. He wasn't like that. And Robert Stigwood was the manager of Cream, and he was also the manager of the Bee Gees. And I mean, there's no question that Robert Stigwood took Cream, and to a lesser extent, but also took Bee Gees for a ride. I mean, he just ripped them off completely.
So the Cream reunion film, how did you get involved in that? How did that come about? Or I mean the farewell film.
Sorry. The reunion film.
Yeah, the farewell. Yeah, sorry.
Well, I got involved in that because I got to know Eric Clapton very well. Because I'd met him. I'd been a few years before. I'd been to see a group called Yardbirds.
Yep.
It's odd because Jeff Beck died yesterday, as you know.
That's right.
Two days ago, he was also in Yardbirds. And I realized straight away, listening to the old Yardbirds with Eric Clapton, that we were dealing with phenomenal musicianship here. And I began to write about them because I was writing for the Observer at that time, to saying, these guys, you've got to take this from a purely musical point of view. You've got to take these people seriously. And when he formed, nobody really knows whether it was him or whether it was Ginger, but formed Cream. Eric asked me to go, I think more or less, to their first ever concert to listen and tell him, did I think this was a good combination?
Really?
Which I did, and I said it was.
Yeah, all three of those guys are very interesting guys, and
extraordinary, absolutely extraordinary people.
Yeah,
and in a way, I mean, Jack Bruce was the most interesting one of all, because Jack Bruce was the son of a communist shop steward from literally the slums of Glasgow. That's where he was brought up. I mean, literally, you can't imagine that all those properties have been pulled down now. But I mean, I went to visit them with Jack. And I mean, I was absolutely staggered. How could anybody survive all of this? I mean, it's really 19th century, dreadful, dreadful. But I mean, he was clearly a talented musician. He'd been to the the Royal Scottish Academy of Music to learn the cello. He was a good cellist, and from the cello came the bass guitar, and then the rest is history. But you know, but Jack never lost the sense of where he had come from, as it were.
I worked for a family from the Gorbals for about 6 years, and they used to say that they literally didn't have a pot to piss in.
No, I mean, it was, the stories that Jack told about living in the Gorbals are absolutely dreadful, dreadful.
And he ends up buying his own island, right?
You what?
He ends up buying his own island?
He ends up buying an island in Scotland, yes.
Is he still alive?
Jack, no, sadly he died about 3 years ago.
Oh, yeah.
And Ginger died last year. But Eric is still going.
And then Ginger moves to Africa, right?
Well, Ginger moved, I mean, Ginger's life was very complicated. He moved to South Africa because he wanted to play polo. And because of who he was, he couldn't get off the ground in the English society, polo playing society. But he had money, so he went to South Africa. And there, I think he married his fifth wife, who was South African. And had a string of horses and played polo all the time. He was very happy.
How is it filming a concert like that? What's the experience like of, say, filming that farewell concert? Is it very difficult, or how does it come together?
Well, I mean, there were all kinds of problems, which had to do with the fact that they wanted it filmed in color, quite understandably. They wanted it. I mean, don't forget the technology in '68 was extremely primitive. I mean, if we did it on video originally, but we had 4 color cameras, which were, each weighed a ton. You need about 6 people to move these damn things. It's not like the kind of multi-flexy, 16 cameras up everybody's nose that you see today. So that was problem number 1. Problem number 2 was that the color video, I mean, those color cameras had just arrived that summer of '68 at the BBC, as had color videotape, but nobody knew how to edit color videotape. You could do it with a razor blade and a bit of sellotape, literally, but you couldn't guarantee the fact that the edit would play. So there was a big problem. So what you see in the finished film, apart from the interviews, you would have seen on the night. I mean, there's no editing in it at all.
Really? Wow. Yeah, it's hard to find a copy of that farewell concert.
Really?
Yeah, I tried to look it up on YouTube, and there's not a cohesive. There was one that was put together from a black and white and a color.
Really?
Yeah.
It's easily available.
Oh, really? Okay.
It's easily available.
So did you visit Ginger Baker when he was in Africa?
I never went to see him in Africa. I mean, I kept in touch with him almost to his dying day, because eventually he came back to live in London, or just outside London. But I was instrumental in getting him, Ginger Baker, to agree to another film, because I made a film with him, Ginger Baker, in Africa when we went across the Sahara Desert to set up his studio in Lagos. But many years later, another director wanted to make a film about Ginger in South Africa, which Ginger wouldn't agree to, but I persuaded Ginger, I think it's probably going to be okay. And that became Beware of Mr. Baker.
Right, yeah.
And I was the producer of that, or the executive producer of that.
So
In that case, it was just a facilitator, really.
you traveled across the Sahara in.
Oh yeah. Well, we made a film called Ginger Baker in Africa.
Yeah. How was that?
Oh, it was fine. It was an adventure. What do you expect?
Yeah. Did you have much experience going into Soviet Russia during that time? Did you ever?
Did I what?
Did you have any experience going into Soviet Russia, like going into East Germany during that time?
Yeah. I mean, I filmed in East Germany. I filmed in Russia. Cool. I wouldn't do it now for all the obvious political reasons. But I made several films in Russia. Made a big film about Stravinsky in Russia.
Yeah.
And I'm just looking at a film, at a brochure which is just about to be going off to be printed about Rachmaninoff, and that was all filmed in Russia. Not all, but most of it was filmed in Russia.
Did the intelligence services there give you a hard time when you were coming into the country?
No, I mean you needed permission to film there, and in order to get permission, you had to tell them more or less exactly what you were going to do, and they didn't like it very much if you wandered off the straight and narrow. But I mean, even the Handel film we filmed part of that in East Germany because that's where Handel had come from. And I also filmed in Poland. I made a big film in Poland of the Gorecki Symphony of Sorrowful Songs. No, I filmed all over Eastern Europe.
How did you? What were your impressions of Eastern Europe during that time?
Grim.
Yeah.
And of course, the Wagner film was, I mean, huge amounts of it were filmed in Hungary when Hungary was still a communist country. No, it's just another location. I mean, once you've got permission, the getting of the permission could be tricky, but it wasn't really. I mean, the Russians wanted a film about Stravinsky even more than I wanted to make a film about Stravinsky.
Yeah.
As they wanted a film about Rachmaninoff. And the Wagner film could not have been made had we not spent, I think it was 6 weeks filming in Hungary.
So you spent a lot of time with Richard Burton then, right? And
Oh, a lot of time, yeah. Well, I mean, apart from the 7 months that we were filming Wagner, yeah, I mean, I got to know him extremely well. I think so, anyway. Anyway, listen, we've been speaking for nearly an hour.
Sure.
I've got to go away and do something else now.
Okay, that's fine. All right, thanks a lot for your time, Tony.
That's okay. I hope you managed to get something out of it.
Oh, yeah, of course. Yeah.
Okay, bye-bye, Brendan.
Okay, thank you, Tony.